What if I told you that this kind of guard is overrated in a certain way, but also that you wouldn't want to get rid of it because it's underrated in different ways as well?
That's just like your opinion, man.
It's pretty obvious why this wouldn't be the greatest idea. Looks pretty risky, doesn't it? But why couldn't you replace a crossguard with something like this, for example, a disc guard? Well, there are good reasons why they didn't. Alright, so I'll talk about the more obvious functions of a crossguard first that you may already be aware of or guess, and then move on to lesser known uses. First off, hand protection. Most swords have a guard, pretty much all, ranging from minuscule to large and complex, whether it be a simple bar, or multiple curved bars, or a disc, or a shell, or whatever other combination. There's usually something there. This Han Dynasty jian has almost no guard. This is more about protecting your hand from your own blade, because it can easily slide up there if you thrust and encounter resistance, and whether the blade hits a shield or armor, a bone, or what have you, the hand might slide and slip up onto the blade even if you hold on to it tightly. Oh boy, I just noticed it in time. And I was slipping up and immediately opened my fingers. And the guard obviously prevents that. It stops it right there. Bronze swords are generally like that. Protection came in the form of a shield. The guard didn't have to do that. And this, again, is hardly much of a guard at all. So again, this helps keep your hand in place. In fact, in this particular case, the hand is locked in between the guard and the pommel here. It's designed to be held with a closed fist like this, which is the strongest grip you can use. It has its pros and cons like everything else. But either way, really all this does is prevent your hand from going all over the place. It can also serve as an additional point of contact. For example, you could put your index finger over the guard. My previous video explains that in more detail. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll link it down below. Or you could even rest the thumb on the guard if it's thick enough. And some have thumb rings specifically for that, just to have this additional point of contact for more leverage and control. In my opinion, a thumb ring doesn't make a big difference for the handling, but some people do appreciate it. Anyway, so when it comes to a simple straight bar crossguard like this, the protectiveness is overrated in terms of passive protection. So what I mean is, if you just hold your sword, you fight with it, whatever, how much of a barrier is this against the opponent's blade that prevents attacks targeting your hands? Not all that much, really. One of the things that could potentially happen is the opponent's blade sliding along the flat. That guard doesn't actually do anything to protect me here. Now, it can still do a little bit because this is not flush, right? So there's a certain thickness to the guard here. So it might be able to still catch that if it just slides straight down, maybe. But what you might be noticing is that it hits that guard and then kind of skips off and goes onto the thumb anyway. It would only help if I turn it in this way. In this case, it does protect. If you have a disc guard, it protects everything 360 degrees, or if you have two rings on either side. If you have a ring, same thing, but pay attention to exactly what happens. If this comes down, where does that hit? Thumb. At this angle, it's not actually going onto the ring, it's going onto the thumb. And I can even do that deliberately by kind of angling it like that. Right? So even in this case, it's not complete. It depends on the angle. If the point is all the way up, sure, that'll do something, right? But a lot of the time, it's forward. So in this case, it's not that protective, actually, and this even less so. You have to really use this very actively. So if a cut comes down, you have to really turn it into it and maybe even grip it a little bit lower to really make sure that you're not being threatened there. All I have to do is just create a little bit of an angle, and now I can even attack this hand, or I can come over here and attack that wrist. I can just go there. It doesn't take that much. Or I can come underneath, I can come here. There's so many ways to still target the hands. So the crossguard doesn't do all that much. Yes, there's a bit of protection for the forearms. So if I want to, say, attack the forearms here, yeah, I need to clear this, right? I need to go above it, which, yes, it's harder than with a smaller diameter in case of a discard or shorter quillons in case of a crossguard, right? I can't just leave my hands out there. I need to pull it in and also move over to the side to use the crossguard to its full effect. How's it with the katana? I don't actually need to do this necessarily. I can just shift it a little bit to the side without needing to turn the edge into it, because there's still protection here. But again, it's not much. I can't just rely on this because there's so little, and it takes just a small adjustment to be able to hit the hands. And in fact, even the rear hand is still relatively exposed. Not as much as the front, of course, depending on what kind of distance we're at here, but this doesn't do that much either. So either way, you need to actively protect your hands to avoid this. If a protective guard is what you want, we're talking something very different. In this case, I don't have to worry about anything. Right? This is completely safe from any angle, really. And even because the basket sticks out fairly far, it even protects my forearm pretty well. Because it's not that easy to get to the forearm. That's the target that's the most accessible out of anything, but it's not that easy either. So now, if I want to target anything here, I really need to move pretty aggressively offline to even be able to get the forearm, which exposes me a lot, right? So this is a much better situation here. Like, yes, I can try to come around here, but it's much harder, and there's a good chance that the blade actually hits the basket before it even gets the forearm. Or even if it does get the forearm, if it starts to cut in a little bit and then hits the guard there, it's also not going to be as effective. It's not going to cut all the way through because there's something in the way. I think this is one of the side effects of the longsword versus katana fanboy wars. You know what I mean, right? Where people got so fed up with this portrayal of the katana as the best sword ever, superior to everything else. And then in the process of debunking that, they overcorrected in the opposite direction. Where suddenly, oh no, the longsword is the best sword ever made. Instead of acknowledging that both have their strengths and weaknesses, and both were designed for their particular fighting styles. And their fighting styles are adapted to their design. It's kind of circular. When holding these side by side, the discard looks kind of puny, doesn't it? This crossguard here looks much more substantial, looks like it would protect you way better. But if you were to F around and find out, as they say, use both of these and rely on these guards to protect your hands, you would find that you're not that much better off with this. Of course, a guard like this is more protective than either of those because it's more complete, if you will. It covers the sides as well, which a standard crossguard doesn't, but it still gives you all of that to work with, right? Yeah, there's still a chance for a thrust to come in here through the rings and get you in the hand. Not super likely, but can happen, which cannot with a solid disc guard. If you want good passive hand protection, you're much better off with something like this, which of course has its own disadvantages, like being much more awkward to carry due to the bulk of the hilt and being asymmetrical, thereby less flexible in its use. It somewhat limits the number of different grips you can use, and also it takes longer and costs more to make. Now, interestingly, if you come up with something like a basket hilt or other complex hilt that has all these curved bars protecting you, you don't really need a long crossguard as well. Yet, a lot of them have that. Just look at these rapiers. They have really long crossguards, even though this cup here does everything you need. The cup together with the knuckle guard is almost as protective as a basket hilt. So why bother with that? So passive protection with a crossguard is what's overrated. It really doesn't do all that much. Active defense, on the other hand, is a different story. For example, Meyer describes using the crossguard to block with, deliberately stopping the opponent's blade with your crossguard instead of catching it on your blade. In that case, a longer crossguard is safer because it gives you more leeway. If you misjudge the precise angle at which a cut is coming in, or you mistime it a little bit, you might end up in a situation where instead of the blade going here, it goes here. So if the guard is shorter, this may be the difference between taking it in the arm and on the crossguard, which, by the way, is also a benefit of curved quillons, because in that case, instead of bouncing off or sliding off, they might catch the opponent's blade. They don't have to be curved, by the way. Straight crossguards with sort of hooks or knobs at the end also prevent blades from skipping off. Thibaut explicitly describes how the corner between your blade and your guard can trap an opponent's blade. That's even more true for this kind of rapier, where the opponent's blade can be trapped either above the crossguard or below. But they didn't always make the crossguards extra long to accommodate these uses. And this is a good example of a sword for civilian everyday carry, where you don't want something terribly bulky. It's easier to carry this way and doesn't get as much in the way. Now, of course, in later times, civilians did carry rapiers which have these really bulky guards. So whatever statement you can make about the drawbacks, the downsides of something, at some points in history they did it anyway because they figured that the positives are worth it. The guard can also provide protection and control in offensive use of the sword. For example, when you win the bind and push the opponent's blade aside while coming in for your own thrust, the crossguard can trap the opponent's blade and make sure that they can't get out of that. There are other offensive uses as well, like striking with a crossguard, of course, whether it be while holding onto the grip or holding onto the blade while fighting in full armor with gauntlets, or hooking and pulling with the guard, whether it be wrenching the opponent's blade aside, or hooking the blade, or a limb, or even the neck with the crossguard and controlling the opponent that way. Or even creative uses like Fiore grabbing the opponent's blade and pinning it on his crossguard to make sure it can't be withdrawn easily. There could be other uses as well that I didn't find evidence for but could still make sense in certain situations, like, for example, if the blade is stuck, grabbing the guard to assist in pulling it out, things like that. Or even Fiore's sword throw, which I've demonstrated in another video, where you can use the crossguard to kind of brace against it with a hand and throw with more power. So there are all these reasons and benefits, but there is no free lunch. There are drawbacks as well. If you hand a sword with a straight crossguard to someone with experience in, say, Kenjutsu, they may find it awkward and may find that it gets in the way. And yes, it does. It's pretty common for beginners in longsword practice to develop bruises on the forearms because they keep hitting themselves with the guard. Particularly in ox guard, for example, whether it be left or right side, if you don't align it right, the crossguard can very easily poke you in the forearm, particularly if you imagine parrying, and so the force drives the sword down into the forearm potentially. And in high guard, you have to be aware of where the guard is, because again, you can easily knock yourself in the head with it. Something like an overzealous thwart cut can end up with the guard in your face, like this. And like I explained earlier, a simple crossguard can give you a false sense of safety because it looks so large, right? But it just doesn't protect you much on the sides, and the hands are still awfully exposed unless you have a complex hilt. And of course, all this hooking business goes both ways. The opponent can very well use your own crossguard against you by hooking with their crossguard or grabbing it. Fiore shows that, where he holds onto the opponent's quillon to really lock in his grip and get full control. Of course, it all depends on the situation. For example, cavalry doesn't need all this fancy stuff I described earlier. They're better off with hand protection without a crossguard. Or you've got things like this that have pretty good hand protection, but not a crossguard as such. And of course, the protectiveness of the guard doesn't matter much when you're wearing a pair of these. So when you're thinking about all these benefits, you might come to the conclusion that Something like this is just completely inferior. Why would you ever use it? Right, well, if you're using a shield, it's much less of an issue. And if you were to carry this on an everyday basis, it's going to be much easier. And when you think about a situation where you get jumped by someone who has nothing but a knife or a dagger, suddenly this is fantastic. So something like a khopesh, for example, which would have been used with a shield, doesn't need a long straight crossguard or any of this business, but I regret nothing. Anyway, I hope that explains the pros and cons and reasoning behind crossguards. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching and take care, folks.